Do you like being ridiculously overpowered? Do you like slaying endless hordes of foes? Do you have a busy schedule and only have a little time every day to play games? Or do you want to sink countless hours into a game, mastering its systems and clearing all of its challenges? Have you played a ton of Vampire Survivors already and want more games like it? Then I have some bullet heavens to recommend to you. And if the phrase bullet heaven means nothing to you, think of it as a reverse bullet hell, where you as a player carve through hordes of enemies with a multitude of ridiculously overpowered attacks. I did a whole video on the whats and whys of the genre, so go check it out if you want a crash course on what it is and why I call it that. I do recognize there are some people out there who prefer the term horde or swarm survival, but I still don't think that captures the sheer feeling of power scaling present in most of these games, so I'll stick with my terminology for the time being. If it bugs you, just pretend I'm saying your preferred genre name instead. But with that out of the way, welcome to my list of 10 great bullet heavens that everyone should try. I should mention before we begin that this list is just a small sample of the genre, consisting of the games that I feel are particularly noteworthy, unique, or just plain fun, with as little overlap as possible mechanically. Mostly. But with that, let's dive into the first and most obvious game on my list. Hot dang, Vampire Survivors is a good game. $5 for dozens of hours of endless horde slaying, power fantasy goodness that caught us all by surprise at the beginning of 2022 and skyrocketed to success in a way that's frankly kinda baffling. It was even a nominee for the Game Awards. The whole premise of Vampire Survivors is simple. You pick a character, you start in an empty field, and then endless hordes of legally distinct but totally Castlevania-inspired foes start spawning en masse to hug you to death. And you have to figure out the most ideal busted build possible to carry you to the end of a 30-minute run. You can use a garlic-fueled aura of death, an endless spinning library of bludgeoning, whips aplenty, endless streams of daggers from your face, super-powered pigeons, flowery dog farts, or so much more to carve a zone of total safety through the encroaching hordes while waiting for the inevitable end after 30 minutes. After that, the Grim Reaper shows up to kindly shuttle you off to your post-game DPS meter so you can fine-tune your build for your next run. What makes Vampire Survivors so compelling despite the numerous clones, imitations, successors, and so on is the sheer level of layered content, secrets, and progression for players to dive into. Sure, there's the traditional method of spending gold to get stat boosts, but that's only just the beginning. There are oodles of unlockable characters, powerful run-changing arcana, and a ridiculous number of secrets, some of which are nearly impossible to figure out without outside help. Plus, there's apparently a proper final boss somewhere in the game, though I'll admit I haven't had the time to go find and slay it. So while most bullet heavens have players diving into runs over and over and over for the fun of it, Vampire Survivors gives them a greater reason to do so if they choose. This gives the game a tremendous amount of replay value beyond the core gameplay loop without feeling terribly overwhelming. Oh, and Stephanie Sterling wrote all of the flavor text for the in-game compendium, so if you're a fan of their irreverent humor, then you're in for a treat. Subjectively, Vampire Survivors may not be king of the genre that it popularized, but it holds a high place that'll likely never descend from. The sheer depth and breadth of content available will always be its greatest strength, while also remaining one of the most easily accessible of the genre for beginners. And for $5, it's dang near impossible to not get your money's worth out of it. Brotato stands alone with its absurdly broad potential for varying builds, as well as the sheer quality of its core gameplay loop, and in my opinion is the current king of the hill for the genre. Unlike most bullet heavens, which have a simple time limit, Brotato instead features a timed wave system, where players must survive their way through 20 waves and then beat a final boss at the end. And between each of those waves, they're offered stats for leveling up as well as a shop, which offers a wide variety of stat ups, weapons, or unique items with a plethora of effects. Players are usually limited to 6 weapons, which range from rocks to wrenches to rocket launchers, but can freely swap between them as long as they have enough currency. The unique items on the other hand have no limitations, can be stacked repeatedly, often with some pretty silly results, giving players an unbelievable amount of control over how their character evolves over the course of a run. Do you want to be a gunner wielding 6 bullet-spraying SMGs that melt down every foe the moment they pop on screen? You can make that build. Do you want to be a total caveman armed with your fists, rocks, and sticks? That's 100% possible. Do you want to be a total layabout, letting your turrets do all the work? I've done it before and it's a ton of fun. Do you want to set the whole world on fire? Yes, you absolutely can do that within the bounds of Brotato. Because Brotato offers such a fine-tuned yet RNG-driven upgrade system, the upper limit on how many unique runs you can do far surpasses its competitors, most of which only allow for a decent amount of builds, sure, but it's pretty easy to feel the limitations after a few hours of play. I guess what I'm getting at is that Brotato doesn't feel like it has much of an upper limit, and since it already has a semi-active mod community with custom starting characters, new items, and reskins, I can only imagine what it'll look like in a few years if it gets enough support, and I look forward to loading it up regularly to find out. While Brotato doesn't fit the Bullet Heaven mold in a lot of ways, it's absolutely worth playing if you're a fan of any of the other games on this list, and worth a look if you've already tried them and found them lacking. Admittedly, my inclusion of Boneraiser Minions into this list is on vibes alone. Unlike every other Bullet Heaven, Boneraiser Minions isn't really one, as the necromancer you control is fundamentally a pacifist. Kinda. Instead of attacking directly, you summon minions that fight for you, from anywhere to weak little guys that barely do any damage, to demons that cleave through hordes of peasantry that dare to set foot on your unhallowed grounds. Otherwise, it follows fairly standard conventions with endless enemy hordes, 1 of 3 to 4 new undead every level, the occasional game-changing relic, and one of the better meta progression systems I've seen to date. Sure, it has small upgrades to give your necromancer extra power and options, but more notably, it has a meta progression system for your enemies, allowing you to selectively add extra foes between the normal waves. This smooths out the difficulty curve and gives you far more time to amass a truly unbeatable horde of undead before the really tough foes arrive. There are also a bunch of extra layers of secret upgrades and transformations, as every basic undead has a potential demonic evolution, as well as secret combos and extremely powerful apex demons, all of which are a delight to experiment with across multiple runs, just to see what works best and what doesn't. I should mention that the whole game is written in a faux Old English that some people can find grating. Personally, I found it rather endearing, and it worked quite well with the tongue-in-cheek tone of the whole game. Plus, you're playing as a medieval necromancer after all, so why not go full forsooth with the writing? Boneraiser Minions is a fantastic game that solidly stands on its own, taking few, if any, influences from Vampire Survivors and introducing a ton of fresh ideas that I've just never seen before. If you're not terribly keen on any other game on this list or just want something unique, Boneraiser Minions is worth a shot. And like everything else, it's dirt cheap. Well, I guess except for Nova Drift, which honestly should come as no surprise that Nova Drift is on my list to begin with, as I seem to go out of my way to try and signal boost it whenever and wherever I can. Which I will continue to do so because Nova Drift is probably one of the cleverest roguelikes on the market and is also one of the only games that is both Bullet Heaven and a Bullet Hell. Or a Bullet Purgatory, I guess? Anyway, I'll admit that Nova Drift is a major outlier on this list as it precedes the current genre by a few years, and it controls pretty similarly to Asteroids with momentum and rotation rather than perfect omnidirectional movement. Despite its differences, the upgrade system and general gameplay fits into the Bullet Heaven genre incredibly well, where players are offered 7 different upgrades with a variety of perks, unique modifiers, and super mods that really change how you play. As such, you can go from a weak little pea shooter ship to an unstoppable burning comet blazing a trail through empty space and foes alike, or a nigh unkillable drone swarm that shreds everything and anything that dares come close, or a massive snake that tail whips foes and itself into oblivion, or the interstellar embodiment of the 4th of July, or Canada Day if you're up north. It also has incredibly clean visuals that put most other games in this genre to shame. I'm an art aficionado, and I really have to give points for polish and style here. For me, Nova Drift will always represent the potential for what Bullet Heavens could possibly become in the future, as well as a great example for how to pack an immense amount of depth into a game with such a small battlefield. Nova Drift is an incredible roguelike, and one that I think that every fan of the overarching genre should play. It's got a little bit of something for everyone, evokes a classic arcade game feel but with far more depth, and never gets old. At first glance, Rogue Genesia looks and feels fairly average as far as Bullet Heavens go, offering a smattering of underwhelming weapons and a bunch of minor but beneficial stat upgrades. The only real standout feature from the start is the Slay the Spire map with branching paths where you go from one battle to the next, rather than staying on the same map for the duration of a run. This also comes with the inclusion of Slay the Spire style relics as well, and while most of them aren't terribly game changing, they do add a much appreciated extra layer of mid-run progression. And then you unlock all the cool stuff. For better or worse, Rogue Genesia locks a lot of the fun toys behind relatively easy to get achievements, so while you'll quickly get access to a significantly larger array of weapons and upgrades to pull from, you gotta play a few ho-hum runs first to get there. It's a trade-off, but I'll grant the payoff is worth it, especially in the face of the nitty-gritty stat optimization that Rogue Genesia offers, which is vaguely on par with Brotato, though there are few if any unique effects that really change how you play. There's also a pretty substantial meta progression system that might end up being 6 to 7 layers deep by the end, which might actually be too much. Hopefully the developer will offer a properly engaging challenge to match that level of player power scaling. As a last minute addition to the script, instead of rewriting it, I'm just going to immediately contradict myself and say that Rogue Genesia's extremely layered and dense content is a joy to wade through. After writing the first part of this segment, I got onto the beta branch for Rogue Genesia, which added challenges, more meta progression, and some much needed adjustments to the core formula that does little to reduce the grind, but makes it far more fun to tackle. Rogue Genesia is a min-maxer's dream game with oodles of stats that you can increase or decrease to the point of absurdity. There are some hard caps, but for the most part everything is extremely breakable in the best possible way. You can even break how the game calculates money, allowing you to buy every single item and power-up in a single run. Most games would just patch that out, but the developer made it a mechanic with an achievement associated with it instead, which is incredibly cool in my book. I'll also say that Rogue Genesia is by and far my favorite bullet heaven at the moment, as it hits that sweet spot between difficulty and grind that makes me want to load it up over and over and over again until I become a truly broken existence when playing. If you want a game that really rewards you for successive play with a wide arsenal and a ton of unlockable weapons and meta progression, where you can fine-tune every stat to fit whatever build you want, then give Rogue Genesia a shot. Speaking of power scaling, Spirit Hunters is almost less about actual gameplay and more about this giant Path of Exile inspired meta progression talent tree. The game is hard, brutally and unfairly so, but that's because you're meant to try and die and improve over and over and over again. Spirit Hunters is an investment, and while it does take quite a while to get anywhere on this massive talent tree, the feeling of incremental progression as you unlock each node is hard to match. And boy does it offer a challenge as well, as subsequently unlocked levels are harder and harder to beat. But you can't just grind out the lower levels either. Most of the higher end nodes on the tree require certain kill quotas for various monsters, many of whom are unique to one map or difficulty. This means you'll have plenty of things to do and work toward as you play, for those of you who need goals and progression to really enjoy a game. Gameplay-wise, Spirit Hunters is fairly formulaic, where players only get access to 4 weapons over the course of a run, each of which can be upgraded up to 40 times with various stat increases. The weapons themselves are a ton of fun to use and each have their own merits, but the lack of variety and unique and interesting mid-run passive effects outside of those weapon stat increases does mean that Spirit Hunters can feel a little flat. But out of all of the available bullet heavens, it's probably the best incremental progress grinder of the lot. Put time in, get ample stat upgrades and a modicum of fun as a bonus. It's also really nice looking with colorful hand-painted sprites and backgrounds, so if you're sick of the pixel mash from most other bullet heavens, then Spirit Hunters is worth a look on that merit alone. 20 Minutes Till Dawn was one of the first bullet heavens to step away from Vampire Survivors' fairly static weapons and passive system, instead choosing to borrow heavily from Nova Drift's signature upgrade system instead, which is by and far the main reason why it's so good, offering players a pretty fantastic degree of build customization and run variety, as well as some truly broken combos if you know what you're doing. It's also one of the first bullet heavens to give players the ability to manually aim at foes, rather than just relying on automatic attacks, as well as bosses with unique attack patterns that can't just be beaten purely through brute force. Most of the time. This means that 20 Minutes Till Dawn has a far higher player skill cap than most traditional bullet heavens and feels far more gratifying when you get a truly broken run going. That small amount of control amidst the chaos of infinite cascading destruction counts for a lot. And you'll know when you're broken, as 20 Minutes Till Dawn has the cleanest and largely clearest visuals of the genre to date. So when you pick a new upgrade, you get to see the direct results visually reflected in how you attack, from split shots to extra bullets to lightning that strikes random foes on the screen. Most other bullet heavens, on the other hand, just rely on small incremental stat upgrades that rarely change how your attacks function. And while you still end up leveraging incomprehensible special effects chaos on your screen like every other game in the genre, it feels far more gratifying as you see your build develop over the course of a run in 20 Minutes Till Dawn. All three of these factors lead to a far more direct connection to every run of 20 Minutes Till Dawn in a way that I don't really get from any other bullet heaven. I honestly can't remember most of my runs of Vampire Survivors, Spirit Hunters, or Nomad Survival because there just isn't quite enough variety between runs to make them feel truly distinct. But I remember almost every single run I've ever done in 20 Minutes Till Dawn, as I feel like I had far more control over my build and how I played, and the resulting fireworks always felt memorable as a result. 20 Minutes Till Dawn is probably the best on the list for people who enjoy theory crafting new builds and tinkering with them endlessly to make them better and better. It's also one of the most fun to directly play, so if you feel disconnected from the auto-battling nature of most bullet heavens, it's worth a shot. Runic Survivors successfully borrows from Noida to create a fairly compelling spellcrafting system, giving players a decent degree of customization and allowing a fair number of really nutty builds. At the moment, there are only 4 base spells to work with: a bolt, a homing ghost, a damaging aura, and an AoE blast, as well as 4 or 5 slots to insert additional modifiers into. These mods range from damage ups to adding extra piercing to projectiles, increasing AoE size, or, and this is where the game really shines, adding on kill, on burn, on freeze, or on hit effects to your spells. My favorite build is to create an extremely large 0 damage aura that sets enemies on fire, with an on burn link that causes enemies to explode in a torrent of ghosts, which then cause enemies to explode in a high damage AoE on death, or just more ghosts. It's a quick recipe to kill the frame rate, or even crash the game, but honestly, that just means I'm winning. And that's just one of many potential game-breaking builds available, and because runs tend to cap out after 10 to 15 minutes, you'll have plenty of opportunities to try a wide variety of combinations. Runic Survivors really captures the essential feeling of trial and error experimentation in the pursuit of truly busted builds, and it hooked me for a fair few hours the first time I loaded it up. I will admit that Runic Survivors is pretty bare bones at the moment, with such a small handful of spells and fairly basic modifiers, but the potential it presents more than earns itself a place on this list. It's definitely worth $3 of fun already, and I sincerely hope it expands tremendously over the next few months to give it the variety and stability that it needs to truly shine. Runic Survivors is a bit of an unpolished gem, but it stands out as one of the most potentially flexible bullet heavens on the market. If you like tweaking spells on the fly to figure out the most powerful combination possible to destroy your enemies with, then you really should give it a try. Gunlocked is an odd duck of a bullet heaven, since it plays like a proper shoot 'em up, like Ikaruga, or ironically, the Bullet Heaven game series. That said, the mid-run player progression mechanics absolutely evoke the same feeling as other bullet heavens, as does the potential power scaling over the course of a run. You might not be an unholy storm of firepower by the end, but you'll definitely be pretty silly with the right build. I'm also including it because Gunlocked is a great example on how broad this genre could be. The first neat feature of Gunlocked is that very few of the weapons fire conventionally, most of which require you to actively line up targeting reticles over enemies in a variety of ways. Which means you actually have to try and shoot your foes, rather than just flooding the screen with projectiles. It's a weird idea, and it actually works rather well once you get used to it, but that could still be an issue for new players. The second neat feature is that Gunlock's weapons and power-ups have very clear synergies with each other, indicated clearly by a robust tagging system and clearly displayed synergies on the level up screen. In comparison, most other bullet heavens just make you guess, and while that can be fun, it's also kind of a pain to keep track of everything yourself, especially if you play a lot of other bullet heavens with their own opaque synergies and evolutions. Don't get me wrong, trial and error min-maxing is still very much the name of the game in Gunlocked, but it still feels far more streamlined because of how transparent it is. There are also some evolved combo power-ups that just aren't that easy to find, so straying from the beaten path is still a good idea. Gunlocked is also farther along in development compared to most other bullet heavens, as it hit 1.0 about a month ago, which is a big plus for me. I'm perpetually buried in unfinished games, and it's refreshing seeing a great idea implemented so well with a reasonably short development time. Ultimately, Gunlocked might not match the rest of the games on this list, but if anything, that's one of its greatest strengths. It's a completely different flavor of game, and is one that I'd gladly be willing to load up when I'm tired of the rest. I really struggled to decide what to include as number 10 since there are tons of extremely valid contenders, so I actually just put it up to a poll. So last, but certainly not least, is Soulstone Survivors, which narrowly won the fan favorite nomination by process of elimination. Anyway, Soulstone Survivors is a fairly traditional bullet heaven, but with absolutely zero limits on how far you can scale each ability, nor any sort of level cap that I've seen so far. So instead of having each ability scale linearly and predictably up to a set level cap, you just keep stacking stat upgrades of varying rarities onto one or multiple abilities every level, organized by a robust tagging system. So if you stack a bunch of missile spells and get an upgrade that specifically targets the missile tag, all of your missile spells will get the bonus. Which means you can go from this to this fairly easily, rather than hyper-focusing on one or two abilities and neglecting the rest. Soulstone Survivors is one of the only bullet heaven games with 3D visuals, which allowed the developers to go absolutely wild with the special effects. Most games in this genre tend to get pretty spectacular by the end of the run, especially with the normally busted builds, but Soulstone Survivors' 3D effects scale in intensity far better than any others I've seen so far. Not only will you feel overpowered as you blast through hordes of foes in this game, you will also look the part. Or you'll have absolutely no idea where you are because you've flooded the screen with too many special effects and can no longer follow the gameplay that well. Honestly, that's a major plus for me, as my eternal goal is to render games unplayable through my actions. And if this doesn't appeal to you, but the game still seems interesting, you can turn the special effects down, so you can actually see what you're doing. Finally, Soulstone Survivors also has some of the most accessible gameplay of the genre, as enemies do not actually do contact damage to the player, and the base difficulty level is fairly easy. So if you're totally new to bullet heavens, this is one of the best places to start and stick with, since it has a fairly robust difficulty scaling and meta progression system to work towards. But mostly, it's just fun to watch. This list is hardly a top 10, nor definitive in any way, shape, or form, and I'll fully admit that this video is probably going to be out of date within at least half a year. However, I still think it's worthwhile to take a moment to feature a handful of what I think are some of the best bullet heavens currently on the market, and to serve as a starting point for those of you curious about the genre that are looking for a good place to dive in. There are a ton of fantastic bullet heavens that didn't make this list, and a ton more on the way that look like they'll either rival or even surpass anything on the market today. But for now, I'm going to stop here and leave all the rest for a subsequent video on 10 more bullet heavens worth trying in a year or two. In the meantime, there are tons of other genres and an absurd amount of games that I'd love to make recommendation videos for. I'm thinking of Metroidvanias for my next genre deep dive? Maybe. But before I go, thank you to all of my Patreons for picking this topic and helping support the creation of this video. And if you aren't a Patreon but are interested in becoming one, head on over to patreon.com/wanderbot. These videos take a long time to make, and the more support I get, the more time I will be able to dedicate to making them. And with that, I hope you all enjoyed my Bullet Heaven deep dive and recommendation videos, and I hope you're looking forward to whatever I do next. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.